Now, in your talk, you compared and contrasted circle protests and line protests. Can you explain to us the difference between the two?
All right. Well, this is an idea that comes from Milan Kundera, and at least it helps us to think about what protests look like. And he says that if you think of a protest with people holding hands in a circle, on the one hand, that looks beautiful and uplifting, but he says, well, the circle prevents others from joining. If everybody's holding hands, you can't become part of it. So it's a kind of a hierarchical protest. Those who are inside and those who are left outside. Whereas a line protest makes one think of a march where anybody can join. There might be a beginning, but there's no end, and you can always join in at some point. So that kind of contrast at least helps us to start thinking about protests. Although I think Kundera's idea doesn't get us too far. I can think of some wonderful protests that are even literally in circles, holding hands in circles and so on. And a protest where people are marching might be rather intimidating. You might not actually want to join it. But at least what Kundera gives us is he forces us to think about the physical nature of a protest and how that relates to whether people want to join it or not.
And you were rather critical of the anti-globalization protests in Seattle and other cities for being exclusive, both in terms of their physical formation and their rhetoric.
Right. This was an impression that I formed, watching them from afar. I'll admit, in the 1990s, that there were two things that seemed to be missing. One is that they were oddly humorless, or their humor was a kind of a bitter type of humor, because I think part of what was going on there is they conceptualized the forces arrayed against them as being so nefarious that so much of the anti-globalization protest was more kind of, they're evil, they're everywhere, after all, they're global. And so there doesn't come a kind of an uplifting or liberating sense out of that. Instead, the humor is bitter. And as I suggested, it's expressed in a slogan which emerges during the anti-globalization era: if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. Which is really, for me, a slogan that falls with a thud. You can either say, yes, I am paying attention, in which case, presumably you're outraged and you're already part of it and you're already engaged, or, well, no, I actually don't know what you're talking about, in which case, there's not a conversation going on. It's not suggesting what you should be outraged about or what you should do about it, other than just pay attention. And then in the form of their protests, the anti-globalization protests, and I want to leave aside the violence, that sometimes came along. I don't want to connect that specifically, breaking of shop windows or whatever, but just thinking about the form of the protests with often very complex performances that were interesting in a kind of an entertaining way, but not something you could really join in. And so I think that's actually one of the reasons why the anti-globalization movement in the end came to be seen as something that was limiting to others. You really couldn't join in.
And you contrasted this with protests in Eastern Europe in the 80s. There was one slogan that you referenced, and I'm paraphrasing, something about police, don't worry, they're not beating today.
Right, come with us, they're not beating today. Right, this is a slogan that emerges it seems, in 1982 in Poland. At a time when the police were definitely beating it quite a bit, so the slogan, has a false promise, but everybody knows it's a false promise, and so it's not misleading. Instead, what it says to people is, we know that you want to be with us. We know that you're afraid, that you might be afraid, or we suspect that you might be afraid. Well, what we offer is, a wink. That, come on, is that the only reason you're not protesting, because they're not beating today? Well, all right, we'll promise that to you. And so, in that sense, it's oddly welcoming, because as you're joining in, you know that they might be beating today. Why wouldn't they? But still, it's sort of a way of getting you off the curb, literally off the curb into the protest.
And it's that kind of humor, that sort of winking theatrics. You told the story of Orange Alternative, and I believe it was Prague.
No, they're in Wrocław in Poland.
Okay.
Yeah.
So could you tell us about that?
So Orange Alternative is a remarkable movement which emerged, it has its origins back in the early 80s, but its heyday is 1987 to 1989. Orange Alternative came up with an idea, sort of anti-idea, which they called socialist surrealism, which meant we're going to not protest socialism is bad or communists are bad, but instead we're going to ape them. And we're going to ape them in such a way that causes others to reflect, well, first of all, it's funny, but also causes others to reflect upon what do I really fear. So, for example, they celebrated Policeman Day by giving flowers to policemen. Or they celebrated the anniversary of the Russian Revolution by dressing up like Red Army soldiers and building a model of the Potemkin battleship and the Aurora cruiser and so on. And then the police come and arrest the Red Army soldiers, or they arrest the Potemkin, or they arrest the Aurora, and it makes the regime look foolish. On Children's Day, 1987, when people dressed up as elves and the police arrested the elves, and you could even hear the police saying, because the elves were wearing red hats, you could hear the police saying into their walkie-talkies, there are some reds over there, we've got to go get the reds.
Two more questions. One, I just wanted to talk briefly about your interesting criteria for, not criteria, but interesting suggestions for analyzing protest: inclusive, pluralistic, and entertaining.
Yeah. Okay, so protest being inclusive, pluralist, and entertaining. I guess the first thing I'd like to say is this probably is a late 20th century, it's related to changes in the world in the late 20th century. So that where, for a variety of reasons, where you can draw protesters in through ideology up through a certain time period. Because of the Cold War, because of changes in ideology, and maybe also because of changes in protest style, and maybe also changes in the way people understand entertainment. No longer is ideology by itself something. In fact, we reach a point where to draw someone in through, to attempt to draw people in through ideology actually backfires. So that the would-be participant might sort of pull back and say, oh, that's not for me. So instead what we see emerging, and I would date this from the 1980s onward, is first of all an inclusive, let's say an inclusive strategy, right, where anybody can join. And as I suggested, I think one can see this so powerfully in the Occupy movement, where it seems like the efforts of participants, let's call them committed participants who have maybe a relatively well-articulated sense of what they want to achieve. Nevertheless, they're almost painful, sincere efforts to welcome in the homeless or people who don't have as clear a sense. So for example, among college activists in the Occupy movement, reaching out to those who are not in college but are of the same age, working class youth, for example. So first you'll have that inclusivity. Secondly, you have, which is quite related to it, you have pluralism. So you are also inclusive by not having one message. You can have a variety of messages, and you welcome all of those messages. This can be seen so powerfully in the revolutions in 1989. One movement that I've written about quite a bit, called Freedom and Peace, was mainly focused on issues relating to the draft. And originally, they were supporting people who were protesting the draft, although they wanted to serve. They just didn't want to swear an oath to the communist regime and even its Soviet ally. But then there were others who wanted to resist because they were conscientious objectors. They were pacifists. Well, they embraced them as well. But there was an interesting moment that emerges in the late 1980s where there are some people in the movement, more nationalist and therefore supportive of the army, who not only say, well, we would serve if we could just not swear this oath, but that they have other issues as well. One of them is an anti-abortion platform. And what's fascinating is that those folks would still show up at essentially pacifist demonstrations. Now, the pacifists wouldn't go to the anti-abortion protests. There was a line that wouldn't be crossed. But they were still welcomed in the movement. There was still an idea that, we're all part of this. Freedom and peace means a lot of different things. So that's a powerful expression in the 1980s, because there's this awareness that, well, after all, we're all against the communists. We all want communism to end. We just, might have different approaches to it. Mm-hmm. And one can see the same thing again in the Occupy Wall Street, where again there's a general sense we all have the same concern. It might be somewhat diffuse, and people are going to approach it from different directions. Some people with maybe some stronger idea, others with particular issues that concern them more than others. So some might be concerned with corporate greed, others might be concerned with foreclosures, somebody else might be concerned with what politicians are doing, and so on. So it might be all these kind of differences.